The morning sun cast long shadows across the rugged Afghan mountains as Captain Marcus "Hawk" Rodriguez adjusted his flight helmet and walked toward his Apache helicopter. The year was 2010, and the war in Afghanistan had reached a critical point where every mission could mean the difference between life and death for soldiers on the ground. Rodriguez had flown over 200 combat missions, but something about this morning felt different. Intelligence reports indicated unusual enemy movement in the Korangal Valley, a region notorious for its deadly ambush and strategic importance to both Allied and Taliban forces. At Forward Operating Base Chapman, 480 soldiers from the 3rd Infantry Division were preparing for what seemed like a routine patrol and reconnaissance mission. Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell, a seasoned commander with silver hair and steady eyes, briefed his men on their objectives. They were to secure a series of mountain passes that had become crucial supply routes for enemy fighters. The soldiers loaded into their armored vehicles, checking weapons and equipment one final time. Among them was Sergeant First Class David Chun, a medic who had saved dozens of lives during his 3 tours. He carried extra medical supplies, somehow sensing they might be needed more than usual. As the convoy moved out, Rodriguez and his co-pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Sarah Phoenix Thompson, received orders to provide air support. Their Apache was equipped with Hellfire missiles, a 30mm chain gun, and sophisticated targeting systems that could track multiple threats simultaneously. The valley stretched before them like an ancient scar in the earth, with steep walls rising on both sides. Local villagers had warned American forces about this area, calling it the place where eagles fear to fly. The terrain was so treacherous that even experienced mountain climbers avoided certain sections. Rodriguez noticed something troubling through his aircraft's advanced optics. Heat signatures were moving in patterns that didn't match normal civilian activity. Groups of armed figures were positioning themselves along ridgelines and behind rocky outcroppings, creating what military tacticians call a killing field. The convoy below remained unaware of the developing threat. Radio communications were functioning normally, and satellite imagery from earlier that morning had shown clear routes through the valley. But Rodriguez's instincts, honed by years of combat experience, told him that his fellow soldiers were walking into a carefully planned trap. As the armored vehicles rounded a bend in the mountain road, the first explosion shattered the morning silence. An improvised explosive device, buried beneath the rocky path, disabled the lead vehicle. Immediately, machine gun fire erupted from multiple positions on the surrounding hillsides. The Taliban had spent weeks preparing this ambush. They had studied American patrol patterns, identified the most vulnerable points along the route, and positioned fighters with rocket-propelled grenades and heavy weapons at strategic locations. The attack was coordinated with military precision that caught even experienced soldiers off guard. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell's voice crackled over the radio as he called for immediate air support. His convoy was pinned down in a narrow section of the valley with minimal cover. Wounded soldiers were crying out for medical attention while others returned fire at muzzle flashes barely visible among the rocks above. Rodriguez responded instantly, diving his Apache toward the enemy positions. But as he approached, anti-aircraft fire filled the sky around his helicopter. The Taliban had prepared for air support as well, positioning surface-to-air missiles and heavy machine guns, specifically targeting rescue aircraft. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. More vehicles were hit by rocket-propelled grenades, and the convoy's ability to maneuver was severely limited by the narrow mountain road. Sergeant Chen was already treating multiple casualties, working frantically to stabilize wounded soldiers while bullets whistled overhead. From his aerial perspective, Rodriguez could see the full scope of the trap. Enemy fighters occupied commanding positions on 3 sides of the valley, with carefully planned fields of fire that overlapped to create an inescapable killing zone. Escape routes had been blocked with rock slides and additional explosive devices, the radio filled with urgent calls for reinforcement, medical evacuation, and close air support. But the nearest ground forces were hours away, and medical helicopters couldn't safely enter the area under such intense fire. The 480 soldiers were completely surrounded, with ammunition running low and casualties mounting by the minute. As Rodriguez surveyed the deadly situation below, he realized that following standard military protocol would likely result in a catastrophic loss of life. The enemy had planned too well, positioned too many fighters, and chosen their battlefield too carefully. Conventional rescue tactics would fail against such a well-executed ambush. The pilot faced an impossible decision that would test everything he believed about duty, honor, and the sacred bond between soldiers. In the next few hours, his choices would determine whether 480 American soldiers would return home to their families, or become casualties in one of the war's most devastating ambush. The mountains seemed to close in around the trapped convoy as enemy fire intensified, and Rodriguez knew that time was running out for his fellow warriors. The radio chatter grew more desperate with each passing minute. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell's voice remained steady despite the chaos around him, but Rodriguez could hear the underlying tension as casualty reports continued to pour in. 12 soldiers were already wounded, and 3 armored vehicles had been disabled by rocket-propelled grenades. Chief Warrant Officer Thompson worked frantically at her targeting systems, trying to identify enemy positions through the smoke and dust that now filled the valley. The Taliban fighters had chosen their locations brilliantly, using natural rock formations and prepared bunkers that made them nearly impossible to spot from the air. Rodriguez made his first attack run, firing his 30mm chain gun at suspected enemy positions along the eastern ridge. The powerful weapon sent explosive rounds into the rocky outcroppings, but the enemy fire barely diminished. For every position they eliminated, 2 more seemed to open fire from previously hidden locations. The Apache helicopter shuddered as anti-aircraft rounds passed dangerously close to its rotor blades. Rodriguez had to pull up sharply to avoid a surface-to-air missile that streaked past his aircraft, leaving a trail of white smoke in the thin mountain air. The enemy had clearly planned for aerial intervention, and they were prepared to shoot down any rescue aircraft on the ground. Sergeant Chin had converted a disabled armored vehicle into a makeshift medical station. He worked with methodical precision despite the chaos, treating gunshot wounds, shrapnel injuries, and severe burns from the explosive devices. His medical supplies were running low, and several soldiers required immediate evacuation to survive their injuries. Private First Class Maria Gonzalez, a communications specialist, maintained radio contact between the scattered elements of the convoy while taking cover behind a large boulder. Her equipment had been damaged by shrapnel, but she managed to jury-rig a connection that kept the units coordinated in their defensive efforts. The Taliban commander, coordinating the ambush, had positioned his fighters with deadly effectiveness. Groups of 3 to 4 fighters occupied positions at different elevations, creating overlapping fields of fire that made movement across the valley floor nearly impossible. They had also placed snipers at extreme ranges, targeting anyone who attempted to organize a counterattack. Rodriguez realized that conventional close air support tactics were insufficient for this situation. The enemy positions were too well fortified, too numerous, and too strategically placed for standard attack patterns to be effective. He needed to think creatively. To break the rules that govern normal combat operations, the pilot began flying increasingly dangerous attack patterns, bringing his Apache to extremely low altitudes where he could use terrain features to mask his approach. He flew between mountain peaks and through narrow valleys, using the helicopter's agility to strike enemy positions from unexpected angles. Thompson coordinated with ground forces to direct their fire at specific targets while Rodriguez positioned the aircraft for maximum effectiveness. They developed an improvised system of communication that allowed them to strike enemy positions just moments before ground forces advanced to new defensive positions, but the fuel gauge was becoming a critical concern. The Apache had been flying combat operations for over 2 hours, and the constant maneuvering at high altitude was consuming fuel at an alarming rate. Standard protocol required aircraft to maintain sufficient fuel reserves for the return flight to base, especially in hostile territory where emergency landing sites were unavailable. The nearest refueling point was over an hour away. and leaving the battlefield would expose the trapped soldiers to renewed enemy assault. Rodriguez faced a decision that violated every safety regulation in military aviation: continue combat operations beyond safe fuel limits, or abandon the soldiers when they needed him most. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell's voice came over the radio with another urgent request for close air support. Enemy fighters were massing for what appeared to be a coordinated assault on the convoy's perimeter. Without air cover, the defensive positions would likely be overrun within minutes. Rodriguez looked at his fuel indicator and made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Regardless of the outcome, he keyed his radio and informed ground forces that he was remaining on station, fully committed to the battle until every soldier was safely extracted. Thompson understood the implications immediately. They were now flying a mission with no safety margin, no backup plan, and no guarantee that they could return to base even if they survived the combat. But she also understood that 480 soldiers depended on their Apache for survival. The enemy assault began just as Rodriguez completed another attack run. Taliban fighters emerged from concealed positions and began advancing down the hillsides, using covering fire and coordinated movement that demonstrated extensive military training. They had waited for the optimal moment when American ammunition was running low and morale was beginning to crack. Rodriguez dove his helicopter directly into the advancing enemy formation, firing everything he had while flying at altitudes that brought him within range of small arms fire. Bullets struck the Apache's armor plating as he pressed his attack, determined to break up the enemy assault regardless of the risk to his own aircraft. The gamble worked. The unexpected aerial assault disrupted the Taliban advance and forced the fighters back to their defensive positions. But Rodriguez knew this was only a temporary reprieve. The enemy would reorganize and attack again. And next time they might succeed in overrunning the American positions. As he climbed back to a safer altitude, Rodriguez realized that he had crossed a point of no return. His fuel situation was now critical. His aircraft had taken damage from ground fire, and the enemy was still in position to resume their assault. The next few hours would determine whether his decision to break protocol would save 480 lives or cost even more. The fuel warning light glowed red on Rodriguez's instrument panel as he circled above the trapped convoy. Chief Warrant Officer Thompson calculated their remaining flight time at less than 30 minutes, barely enough to reach the nearest friendly base under normal circumstances. But these were far from normal circumstances. Below them, the battlefield had become a scene of desperate survival. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell had reorganized his forces into 3 defensive perimeters, using the disabled vehicles as improvised fortifications. Soldiers shared ammunition and water while maintaining constant vigilance against the next enemy assault that everyone knew was coming. Sergeant Chun had performed what many would later call miracles in battlefield medicine. Working with limited supplies and under constant threat, he had stabilized 17 wounded soldiers and kept them alive through sheer determination and medical expertise. But several soldiers required immediate surgical intervention that was impossible under current conditions. The Taliban forces had also regrouped. Their commander, a veteran fighter known to intelligence agencies as the Mountain Ghost, had coordinated similar ambush throughout the region. He understood American tactics and had prepared contingency plans for every possible rescue scenario except the one that Rodriguez was about to attempt. Rodriguez made a decision that violated every principle of military aviation safety. He shut down all non-essential systems in his Apache helicopter to conserve fuel, reducing his aircraft's defensive capabilities but extending their time over the battlefield. The targeting computer, backup navigation systems, and even some communication equipment were powered down to squeeze every possible minute from their remaining fuel. Thompson worked frantically to maintain communication with multiple elements simultaneously. She coordinated with the ground forces, relayed information to distant command centers, and monitored enemy radio frequencies for intelligence about planned attacks. Her multitasking abilities kept the entire operation functioning despite the deteriorating situation. The next enemy assault came from an unexpected direction. Taliban fighters had used a network of caves and mountain trails to position themselves behind the American perimeter. They emerged from concealed positions and began attacking from 4 different directions simultaneously. Creating a tactical nightmare for the defending soldiers, Rodriguez responded by flying his helicopter in patterns that no military manual had ever described. He used the Apache's agility to weave between mountain peaks, appearing suddenly behind enemy positions before disappearing again into the complex terrain. His unconventional tactics confused the enemy fighters and disrupted their coordinated assault. Private First Class Gonzalez had managed to restore partial communication capabilities despite her damaged equipment. She provided critical intelligence about enemy movements, allowing Rodriguez to anticipate attacks before they fully developed. Her technical expertise under extreme pressure proved invaluable to the defense effort, but the fuel situation was becoming desperate. Rodriguez was now operating on fumes, with his fuel gauge reading well below minimum safe levels. Standard protocol required immediate return to base, but abandoning the soldiers at this critical moment would almost certainly result in the overrunning of their defensive positions. The pilot made another impossible decision. He contacted Thompson and explained that they would attempt to refuel from the convoy's emergency fuel supplies. This procedure was extremely dangerous under normal circumstances and had never been attempted in active combat conditions. The plan required Rodriguez to land his Apache helicopter in the middle of the battlefield while under enemy fire. Ground forces would need to provide covering fire while aviation personnel attempted to transfer fuel from military vehicles to the helicopter using improvised equipment and procedures. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell understood the risks but agreed to the attempt. He repositioned his forces to create a temporary landing zone while soldiers prepared fuel transfer equipment from their vehicles. The operation would leave them even more vulnerable to enemy attack, but without continued air support, their situation was hopeless anyway. Rodriguez began his descent while Thompson fired continuously at enemy positions to suppress hostile fire. The Apache touched down in a small clearing barely large enough for the aircraft. With rotor blades spinning dangerously close to rocky outcroppings on both sides, soldiers rushed toward the helicopter while maintaining defensive fire against enemy positions. They carried jerry cans of aviation fuel salvaged from damaged vehicles, along with improvised pumping equipment that had never been tested under combat conditions. The refueling operation took place under constant enemy fire. Taliban fighters recognized the critical nature of the American operation and concentrated their attacks on the landing zone. Bullets whined overhead while soldiers worked frantically to transfer fuel into the Apache's tanks. Sergeant Chung continued treating wounded soldiers even while the refueling operation proceeded around him. He had established a medical evacuation priority list and was preparing the most critically wounded for transport as soon as the helicopter could safely carry passengers. The improvised fuel transfer took longer than anyone had anticipated. The equipment was designed for ground vehicles, not aircraft, and the procedures had to be modified in real time while under fire. Every minute on the ground increased the risk of catastrophic enemy attack. Rodriguez maintained engine power throughout the operation, ready to lift off immediately if enemy forces threatened to overrun the landing zone. The helicopter consumed fuel even while being refueled, creating a race against time that tested everyone's nerves to the breaking point. Thompson continued coordinating defensive fire from her position in the aircraft. She had become the central communication hub for the entire operation, maintaining contact with scattered elements while directing supporting fire against advancing enemy forces. The fuel transfer finally completed. After what seemed like hours but was actually less than 10 minutes, Rodriguez lifted off immediately as enemy mortar rounds began falling near the landing zone. The Taliban had finally organized indirect fire support and were attempting to destroy the helicopter before it could resume combat operations. As the Apache climbed back to combat altitude, Rodriguez realized that his fuel situation remained critical despite the emergency refueling. The transferred fuel was sufficient for limited operations, but not enough for both continued combat and a safe return to base. He was still committed to a mission with no guaranteed outcome. The emergency refueling had bought precious time, but Rodriguez knew they were still operating on borrowed minutes. His fuel gauge showed enough aviation fuel for perhaps 20 more minutes of combat operations, far short of what would be needed to escort the entire convoy to safety through the treacherous mountain terrain. Thompson monitored multiple radio frequencies as reports came in from reconnaissance units attempting to reach the trapped soldiers. The nearest ground reinforcements were still hours away, delayed by roadside bombs and secondary ambush that the Taliban had positioned along every possible approach route. The enemy had planned this operation with meticulous attention to detail. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell faced his own impossible decision on the ground. His convoy's ammunition was running dangerously low, and several vehicles were too damaged to continue moving. He could attempt to fight their way out of the valley with the understanding that some soldiers would likely be left behind, or he could maintain defensive positions until reinforcements arrived, risking total annihilation if help didn't come in time. The Taliban commander had anticipated this exact scenario. Intelligence intercepted by Private Gonzalez revealed that enemy forces were moving additional fighters into blocking positions along the convoy's potential escape routes. The mountain paths that seemed to offer salvation were actually additional killing zones. Prepared in advance, Rodriguez received an urgent communication from his base commander ordering him to return immediately for refueling and rearming. The order was clear and direct, following standard military protocol for aircraft operating in hostile territory. Disobeying would constitute a court-martial offense and potentially end his military career. But the pilot also received another communication that changed everything. Sergeant Chien's voice came over the radio with a desperate medical evacuation request. 3 soldiers had sustained life-threatening injuries that required immediate surgical intervention. Without evacuation within the next hour, they would not survive their wounds. The moral complexity of the situation became overwhelming. Following orders meant abandoning soldiers who would die without immediate medical attention. Disobeying orders meant risking his own crew's lives while potentially facing military justice for insubordination. There were no good choices, only degrees of terrible consequence. Rodriguez made a decision that would define his entire military career. He responded to base command with a message that would later become legendary among combat pilots. Unable to comply with return orders due to ongoing medical emergency. Remaining on station until all personnel are secured. Thompson understood the implications immediately. They were now operating completely outside military authorization, using critical resources without permission, and risking their own lives for a mission that had no official sanction. But she also understood that sometimes the right choice was not the authorized choice. The next enemy assault came with renewed intensity. Taliban fighters had received reinforcements from neighboring valleys, and their attack was coordinated with mortar fire that made defensive positions nearly impossible to maintain. The American perimeter began contracting as soldiers fell back to more defensible positions around the disabled vehicles. Rodriguez flew his Apache directly into the enemy assault, firing his remaining Hellfire missiles at mortar positions that threatened to overrun the defensive perimeter. The helicopter's 30mm cannon tore through enemy formations while anti-aircraft fire filled the sky around the aircraft. 1 Taliban fighter managed to achieve a direct hit on the Apache's tail rotor with a rocket-propelled grenade. The helicopter spun violently as Rodriguez fought to maintain control, auto-rotating toward what appeared to be a fatal crash. Thompson prepared for impact while continuing to coordinate defensive fire from ground forces. Rodriguez performed what aviation experts would later describe as an impossible recovery. Using techniques that violated standard flight procedures, he managed to stabilize the damaged aircraft and maintain limited flight capability. The Apache limped back to altitude with severely compromised handling characteristics and reduced defensive capabilities. The damage assessment was devastating. The helicopter's tail rotor was partially destroyed. Fuel lines had been severed, and several critical systems were offline. Any rational military assessment would require immediate emergency landing and abandonment of the mission. But Rodriguez and Thompson were no longer operating under rational military guidelines. Sergeant Chun completed emergency stabilization procedures for the 3 critically wounded soldiers. He had performed battlefield surgery using improvised equipment and techniques learned during previous deployments. The soldiers were alive but required immediate evacuation to survive. The convoy's tactical situation continued deteriorating. Enemy forces had surrounded their position completely, and ammunition supplies were nearly exhausted. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell estimated that his forces could maintain defensive operations for perhaps another hour before being overwhelmed by superior numbers. Rodriguez faced the ultimate test of his commitment to his fellow soldiers. His helicopter was barely flyable, his fuel was nearly exhausted, and continuing operations would almost certainly result in the loss of his aircraft and crew. But 3 soldiers would die without immediate evacuation, and 477 others remained trapped in an impossible situation. The pilot made a final decision that would either save hundreds of lives or cost additional ones. He informed Thompson that they would attempt medical evacuation of the critical casualties while continuing combat operations with their severely damaged aircraft. The plan was suicidal by any objective measure. Landing a damaged helicopter under enemy fire to evacuate wounded soldiers violated every safety protocol in military aviation. The aircraft might not survive another landing, and even if it did, takeoff with wounded passengers would strain the damaged systems beyond their limits. But Rodriguez also knew that military medals were not awarded for following safe procedures. They were earned by soldiers who chose to risk everything for their brothers and sisters in arms. As he began another descent toward the battlefield, he accepted that this mission might be his last. The damaged Apache helicopter struggled to maintain altitude as Rodriguez brought it down toward the makeshift landing zone. The partially destroyed tail rotor created violent vibrations throughout the aircraft, and Thompson had to brace herself against the instrument panel while continuing to coordinate defensive fire from ground forces. Sergeant Chen had prepared the 3 critically wounded soldiers for evacuation. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres had sustained severe shrapnel wounds to his abdomen and was losing blood despite emergency medical intervention. Corporal Jennifer Walsh had suffered traumatic brain injury from an explosion and required immediate neurosurgical attention. Private James Cooper had 3rd-degree burns over 30% of his body and was going into shock. The landing zone had become even more dangerous since the previous emergency refueling. Taliban forces had adjusted their positions to concentrate fire on the only area where helicopters could safely touch down. Machine gun nests and sniper positions now covered every approach route, making the evacuation attempt nearly suicidal. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell committed his remaining ammunition reserves to creating a protective corridor for the medical evacuation. His soldiers fired everything they had while the Apache approached, creating a brief window of suppressed enemy fire that might allow the helicopter to land and take off with casualties. Rodriguez's approach was unlike anything taught in flight school. The damaged aircraft required constant control inputs to prevent it from spinning out of control, and the power settings necessary to maintain flight were critically close to engine failure parameters. One mistake would result in a crash that would kill everyone aboard. Private Gonzalez had managed to establish communication with distant air support that was finally approaching the valley. 2 F-16 fighter jets were en route but still 30 minutes away, armed with precision-guided weapons that could neutralize enemy positions if the ground forces could maintain their perimeter until the jets arrived. The Apache touched down hard in the confined landing zone, its damaged rotor system creating a cloud of dust and debris that provided temporary concealment from enemy observers. Soldiers rushed toward the aircraft, carrying the wounded on improvised stretchers while maintaining suppressive fire against enemy positions. Loading the casualties required precious minutes that the defenders could barely spare. Each wounded soldier had to be carefully positioned inside the helicopter to avoid aggravating their injuries, while ensuring the aircraft's weight and balance remained within flyable limits. Sergeant Chun provided medical guidance while bullets whistled overhead. Thompson worked frantically to reconfigure the Apache's interior space to accommodate wounded passengers. The attack helicopter was never designed for medical evacuation, and every piece of medical equipment had to be secured to prevent it from becoming deadly projectiles during flight. The Taliban forces recognized the critical nature of the American evacuation attempt and launched their most concentrated attack yet. Mortar rounds began falling around the landing zone while machine gun fire swept across the defensive perimeter. Enemy fighters advanced under covering fire, determined to overrun the American position before the medical evacuation could be completed. Rodriguez kept the engines running throughout the loading process, ready to attempt immediate takeoff if enemy forces threatened to overrun the landing zone. The damaged helicopter consumed precious fuel while sitting on the ground, further reducing their already critical reserves. Staff Sergeant Torres lost consciousness as soldiers lifted him into the aircraft. Sergeant Chen immediately began emergency resuscitation procedures while the helicopter's medical equipment monitored his vital signs. The soldier's condition was deteriorating rapidly, and only immediate surgery could save his life. Corporal Walsh remained conscious but disoriented from her head injury. She kept asking about her fellow soldiers while medics secured her to a stretcher inside the cramped aircraft. Her condition was stable for the moment, but traumatic brain injuries were unpredictable and potentially fatal without proper medical intervention. Private Cooper's burns required constant monitoring and pain management. Sergeant Chain administered morphine while ensuring the soldier's airway remained clear despite smoke inhalation injuries. The young soldier's condition was critical but survivable with immediate treatment at a military hospital. The loading process took 8 minutes that felt like hours to everyone involved. Enemy fire intensified as Taliban fighters realized the Americans were attempting to evacuate their wounded. Several soldiers were hit while providing covering fire, adding to the casualty count and straining the defensive perimeter even further. Rodriguez attempted takeoff with his overloaded and damaged aircraft just as enemy mortar rounds began falling directly on the landing zone. The Apache struggled to lift off with the additional weight of wounded soldiers and medical equipment. Its damaged rotor system protesting against the increased demands, the helicopter cleared the ground, just as a mortar round exploded where it had been sitting moments before. Shrapnel peppered the aircraft's armor plating while Rodriguez fought to maintain control of the unstable aircraft. The climb to safe altitude took twice as long as normal, exposing them to additional ground fire during the most vulnerable phase of flight. Thompson immediately established radio contact with the nearest military hospital to alert trauma surgeons about the incoming casualties. She provided detailed medical information about each wounded soldier while monitoring the aircraft's failing systems and maintaining communication with ground forces, but the evacuation success came at a terrible cost. The defensive perimeter had contracted significantly during the medical evacuation, and ammunition supplies were now critically low. The remaining 477 soldiers faced an increasingly desperate situation with reduced defensive capabilities and no immediate prospect of rescue. Rodriguez faced another impossible decision. His fuel reserves were nearly exhausted, his aircraft was barely flyable, and the wounded soldiers required immediate medical attention. But leaving the battlefield now would abandon 477 soldiers to almost certain death or capture by enemy forces. As the damaged Apache climbed toward the mountain peaks with its precious cargo of wounded soldiers, Rodriguez realized that saving 3 lives might have doomed hundreds of others. The moral complexity of battlefield decisions would haunt him, regardless of the ultimate outcome of this impossible mission. Rodriguez flew the damaged Apache toward the nearest military hospital while monitoring fuel gauges that showed less than 10 minutes of flight time remaining. The wounded soldiers in the back of the aircraft were receiving emergency medical care from Thompson, who had quickly learned basic trauma procedures from Sergeant Chun's instructions over the radio. Staff Sergeant Torres had stabilized temporarily, but his condition remained critical. The emergency medical equipment showed irregular heart rhythms that indicated internal bleeding was continuing despite field treatment. Every minute of flight time brought him closer to life-saving surgery, but also consumed precious fuel needed for the return journey to save the remaining soldiers. The military hospital appeared ahead through the mountain passes, its landing pad surrounded by trauma teams that Thompson had alerted by radio. Medical personnel stood ready with emergency equipment while surgeons prepared operating rooms for multiple critical casualties arriving simultaneously. Rodriguez executed an emergency landing that tested every skill he had learned during 15 years of military aviation. The damaged helicopter touched down heavily on the hospital pad while medical teams rushed toward the aircraft. The 3 wounded soldiers were transferred to emergency care within minutes of landing. But there was no time for Rodriguez to rest or assess his aircraft's damage. The fuel gauges showed empty, warning lights covered his instrument panel, and hydraulic fluid was leaking from damaged systems. Any rational pilot would ground the aircraft immediately for emergency repairs and safety inspection. Instead, Rodriguez made the most difficult decision of his military career. He ordered Thompson to remain at the hospital to coordinate with medical teams while he attempted to return to the battlefield alone. The damaged Apache could barely carry one pilot safely, and he refused to risk his co-pilot's life on what was likely a suicide mission. Thompson refused to abandon her pilot and fellow soldiers. Despite Rodriguez's direct order, she climbed back into the aircraft and strapped herself into her position. She understood that coordinating air support for 477 trapped soldiers required 2 crew members, regardless of the personal risk involved. The hospital crew provided emergency fuel and basic repairs to critical systems, while Rodriguez and Thompson prepared for their return flight. Military mechanics worked frantically to patch damaged fuel lines and stabilize the helicopter's failing hydraulic systems, but major repairs would require hours that the trapped soldiers didn't have. As they lifted off from the hospital, Rodriguez received urgent radio communications from the battlefield. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell reported that enemy forces were massing for what appeared to be a final assault on the American perimeter. F-16 fighter jets had arrived overhead but couldn't engage enemy targets without risking friendly fire casualties due to the close quarters combat situation. The flight back to the battlefield tested the Apache's failing systems beyond their limits. Rodriguez had to constantly adjust controls to compensate for the damaged tail rotor, while Thompson monitored engine parameters that showed multiple systems operating well beyond safe limits. The helicopter was literally falling apart around them. Private Gonzalez's voice came over the radio with intelligence that changed everything. She had intercepted Taliban communications indicating that enemy commanders were planning to execute captured American soldiers if their demands for safe passage weren't met within 1 hour. The stakes had suddenly escalated beyond battlefield tactics to war crimes prevention. Rodriguez arrived over the battlefield to find a desperate situation. The American defensive perimeter had contracted to a small circle around the remaining vehicles, with soldiers sharing the last of their ammunition while enemy forces prepared for their final assault. Bodies of fallen fighters from both sides littered the valley floor. The F-16 jets overhead could provide devastating firepower against enemy positions, but the close proximity of American and Taliban forces made precision strikes impossible. The fighter pilots requested clear targeting information that ground forces couldn't provide without exposing themselves to enemy fire. Rodriguez made another decision that violated every safety protocol in military aviation. He flew his damaged Apache directly between the opposing forces at extremely low altitude, marking enemy positions with his aircraft's targeting laser while under intense ground fire from multiple directions. The tactic worked brilliantly and nearly cost him his life. Enemy fighters concentrated their fire on the slow-moving helicopter, while the F-16s used the targeting information to deliver precision strikes against Taliban positions. Explosions erupted across the hillsides as guided weapons eliminated machine gun nests and mortar positions. But the Apache took multiple hits during the target marking runs. The aircraft's armor prevented catastrophic damage, but several systems failed completely, including the primary flight controls and main weapon systems. Rodriguez was now flying a helicopter that was more wreckage than aircraft. Thompson maintained communication between the F-16s ground forces, and distant command centers while the battle raged around them. Her coordination efforts allowed the fighter jets to eliminate enemy positions systematically while avoiding friendly fire incidents that could have killed American soldiers. The tide of battle shifted dramatically as precision airstrikes eliminated key enemy positions. Taliban fighters began withdrawing from advanced positions as their command structure was disrupted by the coordinated air assault. For the first time in hours, American soldiers could move beyond their defensive perimeter. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell seized the opportunity to begin convoy movement toward evacuated positions. His soldiers provided mutual support while advancing through terrain that had been cleared by airstrikes. The evacuation began to look possible for the first time since the ambush started. But Rodriguez's fuel situation had become critical again. The return flight to the hospital and back to the battlefield had consumed nearly all of his remaining reserves. He estimated less than 5 minutes of flight time before fuel exhaustion, insufficient to escort the convoy to safety through the mountain passes. The pilot faced his ultimate test of commitment to his fellow soldiers. He could attempt emergency landing and abandon the aircraft, ensuring his own survival while leaving 477 soldiers to complete their evacuation without air cover. Or he could continue flying until fuel exhaustion, providing maximum support for the convoy's escape while accepting almost certain death when his aircraft crashed. Rodriguez keyed his radio and informed Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell that air cover would continue until the last soldier was safely evacuated. He didn't mention that this commitment would cost him his life, understanding that ground forces needed confidence, not additional concerns about their air support. The convoy began its desperate escape through the mountain passes while Rodriguez flew overhead in his dying Apache helicopter. The aircraft's engines ran on fumes, multiple warning systems screamed alerts, and hydraulic fluid covered the cockpit floor from damaged lines. Yet the pilot maintained his protective circle above the moving vehicles, ready to engage any enemy forces that threatened the evacuation. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell coordinated the convoy movement with military precision despite the chaos surrounding them. Soldiers who had been trapped for hours suddenly found themselves advancing toward freedom, their morale restored by the knowledge that air support remained overhead. Vehicle commanders reported their status as they navigated the treacherous mountain roads. Private Gonzalez monitored enemy communications and discovered that Taliban forces were attempting to regroup for one final attack on the escaping convoy. Enemy commanders had positioned reserve fighters along the expected escape route, hoping to inflict maximum casualties even as their main assault had been broken by precision airstrikes. Thompson worked frantically to coordinate between the F-16 jets, the escaping convoy, and distant command centers that were finally able to provide additional support. Ground reinforcements were approaching from multiple directions, but they were still an hour away from reaching the trapped soldiers. Rodriguez's fuel gauges showed empty, but the engines continued running on whatever vapors remained in the system. He knew that engine failure was imminent, but he also knew that the convoy would need every minute of air cover to successfully navigate the remaining enemy positions. Between them and safety, the first engine failed just as the convoy entered the most dangerous section of the escape route. Rodriguez felt the Apache shudder and begin losing altitude as power dropped by half. Thompson prepared emergency procedures while continuing to coordinate defensive operations, understanding that they might have minutes or seconds before complete aircraft failure. Staff Sergeant Torres, Corporal Walsh, and Private Cooper had all survived their emergency surgery at the military hospital. Medical teams reported that the rapid evacuation had saved all 3 lives, and their conditions were stabilizing under intensive care. The risks Rodriguez had taken during the medical evacuation had achieved their intended purpose. Enemy forces launched their final desperate attack against the escaping convoy just as Rodriguez's second engine began showing failure warnings. Taliban fighters emerged from concealed positions along the mountain road, firing rocket-propelled grenades and machine guns in a last attempt to stop the American escape. Rodriguez dove his failing Apache directly into the enemy assault despite having no functioning weapons and rapidly failing flight controls. The mere presence of the attack helicopter disrupted enemy coordination and provided psychological support for ground forces who could see their air cover still. Fighting alongside them, the damaged helicopter struck an enemy position during what Rodriguez intended as a low-level intimidation pass. The impact destroyed the Taliban machine gun nest but also caused catastrophic damage to the Apache's remaining flight systems. Rodriguez found himself flying an aircraft that was disintegrating around him. Thompson maintained radio communications, even as the helicopter began its final descent toward the rocky mountainside. She coordinated the convoy's passage through the last enemy checkpoint while preparing for an emergency crash landing. That might not be survivable given the terrain and aircraft condition, Lieutenant? Colonel Mitchell's voice came over the radio with words that would echo through military history. Hawk, you've saved us all. Complete the mission and get home safe. The convoy commander understood the sacrifice being made overhead and wanted to ensure that Rodriguez knew his efforts had achieved their purpose. The Apache helicopter's final moments of flight were a testament to Rodriguez's exceptional piloting skills. He managed to control the disintegrating aircraft long enough to protect the convoy's passage through the last enemy positions before the inevitable crash became unavoidable. But fate intervened in the form of a small mountain meadow that appeared through the smoke and chaos. Just as the helicopter's controls failed completely, Rodriguez executed an auto-rotation landing that aviation experts would later study as an example of impossible flying. Under extreme conditions, the Apache touched down hard in the meadow, its rotor blades shattering against rocks while the fuselage skidded across the rough terrain. Rodriguez and Thompson survived the crash with serious but non-life-threatening injuries. Protected by the aircraft's armor and their military training, within minutes, ground forces had secured the crash site and evacuated the injured aircrew to safety. The convoy continued its movement toward friendly lines while Rodriguez received medical treatment for his injuries. Conscious and alert enough to hear reports of the successful evacuation, all 477 remaining soldiers reached safety within 2 hours of the crash. The coordinated effort between air and ground forces had achieved what many military experts considered impossible: the complete evacuation of a trapped force under overwhelming enemy fire without losing a single additional life. The Taliban forces melted away into the mountains as American reinforcements flooded into the valley. The ambush that was supposed to result in one of the war's greatest defeats had instead become a story of courage, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bonds between soldiers who refused to abandon each other regardless of the cost. Rodriguez spent 3 weeks recovering from his injuries in a military hospital, where he was visited by many of the 480 soldiers whose lives he had saved. Staff Sergeant Torres, Corporal Walsh, and Private Cooper made full recoveries and returned to duty, forever grateful for the pilot who had broken every rule to save their lives. The investigation into Rodriguez's actions concluded that his decision to violate flight safety protocols had been justified by the extraordinary circumstances and the successful outcome of the mission. Rather than facing court-martial, he was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross and became a legend among combat aviators. Years later, Rodriguez would reflect that he had simply done what any soldier would do for his brothers and sisters in arms. But the 480 soldiers who returned home to their families because of his courage understood that some heroes are willing to risk everything to ensure that no one is left behind on the battlefield.